And just one funny moment, in this position after knight c2, king d1, if king e2, you had a fork. Black's best move is hilarious, and you have to know it. You have to know Black's best move, because if you play knight takes a1, it gets very dangerous after queen b7. The best move is a6. I'm not making it up. The best move is a6. The only cleanly winning move is a6. And it's prophylaxis. It's prophylaxis. Welcome, everybody watching on YouTube to a speedrun episode. I hope you enjoyed the last one. I had a hour plus of really instructive games. This one might be a little bit shorter. We'll see how it goes. For those watching on YouTube, yeah, we're at the tail end of a long Blitz stream, so we'll see how the games go, but hopefully I'll make it instructive and worth your while. Let's jump right in. As usual, as per tradition, we'll start with a 10-minute game and go from there. We're approaching 1500, so slowly moving our way through the ranks. And we might get another Gleck system here. Well, again, it seems like every time I say that, we face a Philidor. Like the moment I say the word Gleck, they're like, no, I did not attend the lecture, and then d6 is played. So this is like a delayed Philidor. It doesn't change the nature. Well, okay, it potentially will change the course of the game, but our reaction here is still mostly the same. You can play bishop c4, but now that we have committed a knight to c3, I don't love bishop c4, because you might recall that this idea of going pawn to c3 is a very important component of these Italian approaches. So here I would prefer d4. And in the traditional Philidor, the knight usually comes out to d7. So if black plays e takes d4, you're already in some sort of like slightly inferior Philidor, which is slang for like slightly inferior version of an already kind of bad opening. Okay, so black is playing kind of like the Duke of Brunswick against Morphy, except they had this without the knights on b1 and b8, which is a better version for white. You might remember that without the knights developed, Morphy took on e5, and he forced black to give up the bishop pair. Here, d takes e5 is not as sensible because that's just a trade, and it potentially triggers a queen trade. So your temptation here might be to go d5 and lock up the center. But I've talked about this before. Locking up the center in these Philidor positions is typically plays to the favor of the side that's more cramped, and the side that has inferior control of the center, because then you give black a lot of time to kind of reorganize his pieces, and you get a structure that's very hard to handle. So then you might say, okay, well, what about bishop e2? Well, bishop e2 loses a pawn. So what the heck do we do? The move here is bishop to b5, which is a hard move to kind of get yourself to play for several reasons. First of all, it's like maybe hard to come up with it. Second of all, it may have appeared that black can play bishop f3, and I'll address that after the game. a6 encourages us to do what we wanted to do anyway, which is bishop c6. And now we can play this Morphy style. Now that we have eliminated the knight, we can play pawn takes e5, and either black will recapture and lose a pawn. Now, important, the d1 square is protected. So notice that after de, queen takes queen, rook takes queen, knight takes pawn, black does not have mate in 1, which can be very easy to miss. So if black has to play bishop f3, then we recover, we eliminate the bishop pair, our queen gets out to a super active spot, and we'll have a lead in development with horrible pawns on the queen side. So we almost are like strategically winning here. I would go that far, unless black plays this very accurately. Okay, so obviously, I think there's no need to do anything other than just castle. Yeah, and here we should pause for a moment, because really the question is this. We can take the simple approach and play a move like bishop g5, right? And rook d1, natural moves. However, my intuition, it would protest a little bit. You should at least invest some time, because black is 2 entire moves away from developing. Like, black still has his bishop on f8, and you can subdivide our advantage into sort of static and dynamic components. This is often done in sort of higher level chess jargon, but it's a simple concept, right? Static advantages are those that are unlikely to change in the next few moves. Dynamic advantages is something like the initiative, where if black develops, then this advantage will evaporate. So it's a good idea, if you have a dynamic advantage, to press on that advantage to see if you can exploit it. And if not, then you kind of switch to more positional play. So what does that even mean? You might say, okay, so let's go rook d1. Let's play with tempo, but rook d1 allows bishop d6. The move that I really like here is queen to g3. Very good. Some of you mentioned it, because you're hitting both of these pawns. Bishop d6, you can play queen takes g7, rook g8, queen h6, and the queen gets out. And the knight loses its support, and black has no way to press to pressure g2. h6, okay, I don't get that move at all. That just hands us the e5 pawn. Excellent. And we're essentially winning. Queen e7, now the bishop cannot develop, so it's pretty clear that we shouldn't exchange queens. So where should we go with our queen? Well, okay, you can go back to home base, and queen g3 is a perfectly reasonable move. Actually, it's a great move. It might even be the best move. Knight takes e4, you're not allowed to calculate. Like, you shouldn't even look at a move like that. It's losing for a million reasons. Black might castle queenside, but that doesn't get the king to a much safer spot. That's not something that we should worry about. Okay, so queen f5 is maybe a good move, but that allows queen e6. All right, queen f5 allows queen e6, and it's very important if you are the side that is better or winning in these cases, your opponent can use the queen trade as a weapon. So like the weaponized queen trade. And you don't want to trade queens, so after queen f5, queen e6, we have to lose another tempo. And that allows black to bring out the bishop. So instead, we'll play queen g3. If queen d6 here, then we have e5 with a fork. Does that make sense? Yeah, so queen f5, very tempting move. We're not talking here about big mistakes. These are like relatively minor points, but that is what composes, advanced chess level. Knight h5, okay, not a bad move. Where do we go? Well, we want to hit the knight, ideally, so queen f3 comes to mind. The queen f3, there is this weird move, queen e5. And it would be nice to keep the f-pawn unrestrained, so that if black's queen moves up, we can attack with f5. And as I've said many times before, the queen often operates best on the sidelines, as what Yasser said is the supporting actress role. Like, you often want to involve the queen directly, but the closer it is to your opponent's side of the board, the more vulnerable it is. Best move, I think, is queen h3. Yeah, keep it on the side, also preventing castling, and keeping the f-pawn unrestrained. If queen to c5, we have bishop e3. All right. Queen e5 is played. f4. Perfect. Now, bishop c5 check, king h1. And black had no way to protect the knight. Queen c5 check, obviously, we can develop with tempo. And we're going to go after this knight. This knight on h5 is juicy. I'm looking at it, and I'm salivating at the prospect of trapping that knight. So how do you trap this knight? Well, it's got only one escape square. So this is a procedure that you should be familiar with. Yeah, just e5, right? Slicing the connection between the queen and the knight and taking away the f6 square. So technically, black can evacuate the knight with g6, but that's a further weakening move. I'm also seeing the d7 square at any mating square you should be noticing. So not that the move rook d1 is difficult to play, right? You don't have to see that queen d7 is made to play this move. It's an obvious move. But it's always good to keep note of this because black is borderline like collapsing. Well, not even borderline collapsing. Now, bishop c5. That's a good move. So we don't want to take the knight because if bishop takes bishop check. I think the simplest approach here is the best. Just take the bishop and then slide the king over, and black's problems are renewed. Black has to play g6. There's no getting around it. And now, okay, our opponent is doing a good job defending, but the position's too losing. Now, here's an important insight. If we can get black to let's say that in this position it was black to move and black castles kingside, right? How bad is that for us? Does that eliminate our attack? Well, if you look a little bit further than that, the answer is no, because the h6 pawn is, well, it's a type 2 undefended pawn tech. It's only protected by the rook. Black castles, it will be undefended. So if this knight is pushed away, it'll have to drop back to g7. Then our queen can slide up and capture the pawn on h6. And our knight can potentially access the f6 square. But an important insight is that in response to knight e4, black can go queen to d5. Like if we play g4, knight g7, knight e4, right, then the long diagonal is exposed. Black will have queen d5. That's why I really like the move rook d1 here. Not because we're threatening queen d7, although that's a nice bonus, but because after short castles, g4, knight g7, our knight gets to f6 essentially with instant mate. Boom, g4. And after knight g7, we don't take on h6. Right? First, we get the knight to f6 with check. Black will have to either give up the queen or get checkmated. And that's it. Now you see why I put the rook on d1, because here queen to d5. Okay, so would this be a disaster if black played queen d5? No, but it would slow down the attack. Okay, GG. Let's take a quick look. Break this down. The difference between a 1500 and a GM is terrifying. I think I explained most of the logic, but there's a few opening middle game points to expand on, and obviously questions. Yeah, so we face sort of a delayed Philidor, d6, d4. Of course, like at the lower levels, typically people tend to take twice. Like this is very common at the sort of beginner to low intermediate level. And we faced this type of, back when I played the Scotch in a previous speedrun, we faced that. And you want to decline the queen trade here. So the best move is queen a4 check, just earning yourself a tempo. But this is like, I would play queen a4 check. And bishop d7, the queen settles back to b3. So again, it's this concept of the queen as the sort of supporting actress, which I'll expand on with a really cool example from one of my games. Right, queen is out of the way. It's pressuring b7. The computer says the top choice is castles queenside, bishop b3, and white is winning because the king is going to get absolutely cooked on the queen side. And king b8, bishop a6 already, and white's positionally better on top of it because you've got better control of the center. So, anyways, we faced bishop g4, and yeah, here bishop b5 is actually very important. This is the only move that gives you a big advantage. So the big question is, what is our response to bishop takes f3? Well, what's funny is that it's a semi-trick question because the human answer is gf. This is what I plan to do. And you should remember that because you have not committed your king to the king side, and even if, by the way, even if you had, this is not an issue. In fact, I would say this favors white. And again, it comes back to the concept that pawn structure is not the most important factor. In fact, by playing gf, you're opening the g file, which can benefit you in the long run. You're reinforcing the e4 pawn. So just because it's visually unappealing doesn't really mean anything. Of course, the corollary to that is that ed, you can now play queen takes d4. Or you could take the knight first. There's nothing wrong with that. But after queen takes d4, yeah, humanly, this is almost lost for black. Like, black is getting destroyed. I mean, most people would play a6 here, I think. And yeah, bishop takes c6, bc. Yeah, it's like almost +3. And that's pretty revealing because you don't look at this position and think, oh, +3, white is winning. So it's a good exercise to pause if you're watching on YouTube maybe and ask yourself, like, why is white winning? Like, why is this so bad for black? And it's not just one reason. It's the lead in development. That's a big one. Black has no easy way to get the pieces out. If black plays knight f6, your next move is essentially pre-move long castle. Now you're like, well, black gets the pieces out. What's the problem? Bishop e7. But now there's already tactics, right? There's e5. Classic idea because of the x-ray. And who can tell me after DE, what is white's idea? This is an important one to remember. Actually, queen takes e5 also is winning, but what is like the cute little idea? Queen a4, yeah. Slide to the side. And then queen takes c6, and if knight d7, you have rook d7. So in any case, this is the big reason, is that you're just overwhelming him in the center. You have the g file, you have like a collection of assets. So that's a short answer. Well, the funny thing is you could even play queen f3 here, ed and knight e2. But if your opponent plays this, you can hit the button. And this is not very human approach to the position, but it's also great for white because you're going to recover the pawn. So a6 is already like, black is in dire straits. I probably would have actually played DE here. But the real important, the money-making move is queen g3, right? Exploiting the dynamic advantage. You should always check, of course, you should never stop calculating here. You should make sure that the queen gets out, because in some cases, this pawn can be sacrificed successfully. This is not one of those examples. You should never just blindly grab a kingside pawn. And yeah, once this pawn was given away, the rest was super straightforward. And of course, rook d1, yeah, and then g4. G4 is not a seriously weakening move. Black has no pieces to attack you with, and the king is still perfectly safe. Okay, a quick example in the next game. Example of the queen not always being at the forefront, or being effective as a kind of war general operating from the safety of the back ranks rather than being at the forefront of the attack. And I have a chess.com article on this. You can Google it, and you can find it. This is actually an example from that article. Here it is. I'm playing a GM. I was an IM at the time. And it's white to play. And white is only one way of successfully continuing this attack. Now, most people, when they look at this position, their intuition is, okay, well, we have the ingredients in place, so it would be madness to want to move the queen. So let's go h4. But h4 is way too slow, and black has this super nasty counterplay against the c2 pawn. So the correct move, or the correct strain of logic, is we need to involve the knight in the attack. Without the knight, the attack is not going to succeed. But where does the knight want to go? Well, it wants to dislodge black's queen, so knight c1 comes to mind. But again, it's too slow because of bishop e4, and black can trade. So the move is queen to e3. It goes back, and the entire point of this move is to support the knight as it jumps to c5. Black's queen has to stay on f7 to blockade the pawn. So my opponent goes h6. He's like, please come back. Nope, knight c5, king h7, knight d3, continuing to involve the knight, e4, knight e5, queen c7, and now the game-winning move. Now the game-winning move. What should white do? You should pause the video if you're watching on YouTube. It's not a hard move, but it's still... Some people I've given this to have had a hard time finding this idea for some reason. It's not f7. f7, black can play queen takes e5, and the game continues. It's not c3, the knight is hanging. f7 is, I think, not too bad, but it's not clean. Not queen g3, because black can defend with g5. The hardest type of move to find in chess is the retreating knight move. The retreating knight move. Knight g4. Retreating knight move. Now, queen takes c2 is nothing, is a nothing burger. There's no follow-up. Black is under attack on h6. g5, queen h3, and my opponent resigned, because there's simply no way to defend this pawn with checkmate. And it's kind of symbolic that the queen returns to h6, but only at the very end of the attack. So that's, I think, a good example to hammer home this point. Sometimes moving back is actually moving forward. Moving your piece back moves the attack forward. All right, let's see if we can get another 10-minute game in, and then we'll play a blitz game or two. Black against Zoomington from Malta. Ooh, very cool. All right, London system, which we faced, and I think I've had a lot of tutorials on the London. Most of you should know what the move is. Oh, sorry. I did not mean to do that. Fortunately, I caught this only 2 moves in. We're facing a London. So the move here is c5. The move that I recommend is c5. It's a combative line. It's a line that forces white to demonstrate knowledge, or else white is worse. c3, white is already worse, if you can believe that. The move c3 is so natural, white is already worse. Because we play cd. And does anybody know, after white recaptures, what is the move? Why is white in such early trouble? Yeah, queen b6, which is logical because this is the drawback of the London. The b2 pawn is unprotected. So this is the point of c5, is to get the queen in most lines to b6 as quickly as possible. And amazingly, white has a very hard time protecting both of these pawns. Queen d2, white is close to losing now, if he's not very careful. So now you might get very excited, but you have to be disciplined here, because knight e4 is an opportunity, a possibility that should excite you. But knight e4 here, there's queen c2. And actually, white is like forking 2 minor pieces. Way too early for that. The other possibility that might excite you, you should notice that the king and the queen are aligned. So perhaps some of you are like in some positions thinking, what about e5? And it's definitely a big idea, but again, way too early, because bishop b4 doesn't win the queen. White can develop the knight and block. So we need to start by getting a little bit more fuel. We need more attacking firepower, or shall I say horsepower. Knight c6. Now, I actually will, disclaimer, I don't fully remember. Like, I know it's already very bad for white, but there are some tactical lines here that I haven't reviewed, but I'll do my best. Like, at some point, e5 becomes a very powerful possibility. Again, to continue our through line, this is a position where you're better dynamically, right? Our advantage isn't an advantage in pawn structure. We're better because white is underdeveloped and because the queen on d2 is very awkward. And that is why you should already be thinking tactically. And you should be very critical of moves like e6. It's too slow. You're going to lose the opportunity. You're going to let white develop. And then the initiative will fizzle out. So here your intuition actually should already be the move e5. Like, you should be really dying to play e5 here because it opens everything up. It opens up the bishop. Now that we have brought another piece out, I think the time is ripe for e5. So let me calculate for a second. I'm going to take a 30 seconds just to calculate. I want to make sure I'm not doing something stupid. So there. Okay, there. Oh yeah, I think I remember. Actually, wait a second. Wait. Huh. I seem to remember that g5 is also a move here. There's some combination of e5 and g5. Yes, I'm pretty sure e5 is the move. But you have to be very disciplined here. Like now we're in tactical territory, you need to calculate. So I'm going to be saying a lot of moves. If you're watching and you're a newer player, don't feel flustered. I mean, that's totally okay not to be able to visualize everything after the game. I'll make all these moves on the board. So don't worry if you're lost. Okay. So the question now is, do we play knight e4 or do we play bishop b4? The most obvious sequence is bishop b4, knight c3, and then knight e4. But the line doesn't stop there. White plays queen c2, and we're at a bit of a dead end. If you notice, if you can visualize that position, the knight is hanging on e4. It's not easy to reinforce the pressure. Okay, so actually, I like the more flexible way to start, which is knight e4. But then, of course, your question, well, what if white plays queen c2? What's the point there? And there we have actually several exciting attacking possibilities. And one of them is a very unexpected move that I've already mentioned. What are some possibilities that are entering my mind? One is to play d5. White's going to take on passant, and then we open up the light squared bishop. But then we allow a pawn to d6. That can be very dangerous. Another approach here is to expand your field of vision to the other side of the board. And this is something that really requires advanced attacking knowledge, because it's hard to take your eyes away from like the b4 square. But if you look at this bishop, in all fairness, like I think I remember this idea from the file, not necessarily in this position, but I think it might be very strong in this position. Yeah, g5. But who can tell me what is the point? What if bishop g3? How do we follow this up? And second of all, what if white takes this knight on e4? Now, if white takes the knight on e4, you should immediately see that the b2 pawn will be hanging, and the rook is likely to get trapped. And there's also mating ideas. So the question is, do we take on b2 immediately, or we can take the bishop first? And because the pawn on f4 is making contact with e3, that's also quite good, I think. I think queen takes b2 is winning in this case, but you should just notice that gf is also a possibility. And sometimes rushing in to take the rook is not the best approach. Here I think it is. Here I think it's just totally winning. Because there's no question that white cannot trap the queen once it gets to a1. Although in general, you should be very careful about that. I have a good instructive exercise on this from a student's blitz game. Because in general, most of you probably know this, that when the queen is on a1 specifically, oftentimes the enemy queen can return and then box your queen in. And if you can evacuate in time, it'll eventually get... There's a lot of lines that hinge on that. Okay, so lots of possibilities here. We can take on a1 immediately. We can play queen c1 check, but that seems counterproductive. That's just an empty check. We can go bishop b4 check and then take the rook. Let's think for a second. How do we maximize our advantage? Well, in general, you should take the opportunity to develop with tempo when you can. And you're, depriving white of castling rights, so I don't see a compelling reason not to give this check. Gilbar, don't worry about that. They know. I am in contact. Bishop c4. Okay. Here's, the important thing. Let's take stock of the material. We're up in exchange. We're not up a full rook. We're up in exchange. So we shouldn't be too relaxed here. And if we give white enough time, white's going to get the knight out, and white's going to move the king up. And our queen is eventually going to end up in trouble. So we still need to keep playing dynamically. And our opponent is playing very well. I have to give them credit. Very, very good reaction to, this early disaster. Also, potentially there will be a bishop planted on f6. So I'm trying to think what is the best way to proceed. This is such an exciting... I want to spend 30 minutes here and just calculate because it's so much fun. But we don't have 30 minutes. We have 3. There. I have a cool idea, but I'm trying to work it through. So there's basically 2 options. One option is to play queen takes e5. But that would involve sacking the exchange back. I actually think we will go queen e5. It is the practical move, I think. Queen takes e5. Because after takes, white has this nasty little move, bishop f6. But it's not that nasty because the resulting endgame is, I think, if I evaluate it correctly, is very bad for white. In that resulting position, we will take the bishop, but you also have this move knight g4. And it's so funny because then after bishop takes h8, knight takes f2, and then knight takes h1, you're going to get the same problem on the other side of the board. But this time I would be worried that the knight would get trapped. And then white would have 2 pieces for a rook. Probably not worth the risk. When there exists a much more compelling option. Okay, this is just a gift. So white thinks that this is a mate. Well, this is a mate threat. Our opponent doesn't think that. It's true. But common type of blunder. When we take the bishop, it frees up the d8 square for the king, and the game is over. Yeah, a little sad that it was so anticlimactic. I have no doubt that I did not play this in the ideal way. This is, where an engine can be very helpful. And it'll teach us about, attacking techniques. Yeah, the game is over now. 14 moves, but 14 very jam-packed moves. Okay, so g3. What now? Many paths lead to Rome. You might be tempted by knight e5, but knight e5, queen d5 is kind of a weird little annoying idea. I like the idea of involving the rooks. Rook f8 seems like a low-hanging fruit kind of move. We also had maybe some forks, like we had queen g4, queen e4, queen e fork. In general, I know I don't like the phrase in such positions, but in such positions, what are the things that you should be looking for? Looking fork. Of course, we're playing for mate, but the undefended pieces are everywhere. So I'm somewhere in my mind, I'm keeping a mental note of queen d5 check and the potential forking squares. So rook f2, are we afraid of knight h3? Well, you know the answer to that. That is a rhetorical question. Knight h3, we have, for example, queen g4 check. Forking the king and the bishop, by the way, and leading to mate. I have a feeling that might happen. Okay, check. Let's get the king to safety. Yeah, king is perfectly... We didn't even need our queen side. They're just chilling the entire game. The entire game, they've just been ding chilling. Nice. Knight h3 played. There we go. And queen g4 check. Fork. Yeah, it's just mate. Everything is falling. Maybe, I feel like our opponent is furiously trying to play king e1 and it keeps making that buzzing sound. Bzz, bzz, which is kind of annoying. Good game. All right, fun game. And let's jump right in. A full disclosure, obviously I will check the opening here just to see, because this is in a file that I've been making on the London, but I have forgotten it, of course. So first of all, let's fast forward a little bit, and I'll give you the quick rundown of what the alternatives are to c3. You can find in older videos, I've done that already, so we won't take too long on the other moves. Okay, the short answer is white has 3 moves that are, serious here. The best move objectively is probably d5, although it's close. e3 is by far the most popular move, and dc is a move that's not played often, but is more venomous than it may seem. So c3 is a mistake. cd, cd. Queen b6, queen d2. Yeah, knight c6 is correct. e3, okay. Yeah, so actually e5 is a decent move. The best move, according to the computer, is knight e4 immediately. And the point... Oh, queen... Okay, this is incredible. So the point is that after queen c2, we have the move knight to b4. Just literally, who needs the knight on e4? We have another one. And what is the idea? Well, once it's played, I think it's pretty obvious. We have d5. And let's say queen moves back. It cannot keep contact with the square. Knight c2 check, king d3, knight a1. And because of the compromised position of the king, and the fact that the b2 pawn is saying this knight is not in that much danger. White has no moves here. If king to c1, then we can just bring our bishop out, our light-squared bishop out to f5 or even bishop d7. And rook c8 is coming next. It's a pre-move. Yeah, knight c3, rook c8. And white can't go king b1 because of rook takes c3. So we're the queen is paying tremendous dividends. So in this position, white actually is supposed to go back to c1. And now the best move is g5. So this idea does make an appearance, but it's here. g5, bishop g3. And, okay, what is the point of g5? Well, first of all, the point is to have an on-demand bishop pair whenever we want it. The point of this move in the sort of standard execution is to follow up with h5. And this is an idea that you should be very familiar with because it occurs in many openings. In the Jobava London, it's super common. There's a lot of traps associated with it. But for instance, in the Jobava London, one of the most common ideas is, okay, just making some random moves just as to illustrate the example. The white knight lands on e5. Black unsuspectingly makes some random move. And suddenly after g4, you get this situation where black is in huge trouble. Why is it so bad? Because you're threatening to trap the bishop, and in order to untrap it, you have to allow knight takes g6, and you have to take with this pawn, which leads to a completely disastrous creation of these weaknesses. And which has a chain reaction, because now you have to get your king out in order to defend the pawn. Okay, so this is an idea that you have to remember, because it happens everywhere. Here, white can play the move f3, but it has the equivalent effect. After knight takes bishop, pawn takes, this pawn is a serious target. Now you can go d5, and black is solidly better. So after we played e5, white is supposed to take with a, well, okay, taking with the bishop is also possible, but de is not so bad. Knight e4, queen c2, g5 is the best move. Wow, we followed the top computer line. So here, bishop g3, h5 loses for white. It's just losing. And notice how the knight is just chilling here on e4. Because anytime queen e4 happens, we have queen b2. And on top of that, we'll be threatening to trap the bishop. So here, f3 is no longer a move, because e3 will hang with check. And if white plays h3, well, white loses everything all the same. White has literally no defense to h4. So this is the best move. Black is only slightly better here. Of course, when I look at this position, I think minus 0.6. Bishop takes g5, best move. And here, bishop b4 check is quite decent. According to the computer, the best move. Okay, this just gets into engine nonsense. Okay, I can give you 15 attempts and you will not guess the best move. Like, it is literally impossible to come up with the best. The second best is queen c1 check, which I mentioned. Okay, the best move is to rook g8. Rook g8. And the point is actually not hard to understand. You're attacking the bishop, and you're making an improving move, which is going to pay dividends because of the next two moves. Now the computer says, don't take the rook, go queen c1 check, and after king e2, b6 to prepare bishop a6, which of course is an idea that I did see, and this is a common attacking idea. Where does the rook pay dividends? Well, let's just skip a move. Now you can begin to see why this is good, because in a situation like this, the king cannot evacuate down the g-file, and the rook joins with the queen to attack g2. But you should understand that the rook is better on g8 than on h8. You don't have to see that it attacks g2 in that line. So after b6, the best move for white is knight d2. The only move is knight d2. Now you do take the rook, and black is much better. Insanity. We played bishop b4 check, which is also quite decent. But kudos to our opponent. I think he responded quite well. And last thing where I'll mention the computer line, bishop c4 is a decisive mistake, and queen e5 is correct, and black is winning. The only way for white to preserve dynamic balance was to play knight f3, simply, protecting e5. And now, I was actually planning to play a really interesting sequence. I was planning to play d5 here, which most people would reject because of en passant, but the point is just to get pieces out as quickly as possible. And, you know, if you're really interested in developing your tactical sense, analyzing with the computer for like 5-10 minutes when you get a crazy position, don't just dismiss the computer lines. Try to understand them, because this is one of the best way to improve your dynamic sense and use computers for good. Bishop c4, short castle is the line. So one way that you could learn, for example, you could ask, okay, why is the best computer move bishop d3? Why is it not bishop e6? Well, the reason is that the rook opens up, and I'll let you do the grunt work. But after bishop d3, queen g7, the position is really unclear. It's incredibly messy. Equal. Like, the computer lines get insane here. And I'll let you analyze on your own if you're interested. But our opponent understandably wanted to pressure f7 and allowed queen takes e5. And now, unfortunately, white is in huge trouble. I think the best chance was to take and play bishop f6. And yeah, knight g4 is winning, actually. So knight g4 is winning. White doesn't have enough pieces there. But knight takes c4 is also excellent. And then you could get the bishop out like this. And, I mean, look at the difference in piece activity. In this endgame, you have a 2-on-1. Black is technically winning here. Pretty incredible stuff. So up until bishop c4, white was doing great. Big props to our opponent. Obviously, this was not his best moment of the game, and now we're just completely winning. Any questions about what I just showed, like about the lines themselves? And then I'll emphasize a couple things to remember, and we'll do maybe one more blitz game. Yeah, so c3 is the third most common move in the database. And online, it's even more common. And yeah, you could actually also play queen b6 right away. Queen b6 right away might be the savvier move order. Oh yeah, this is really important. Actually, the way I played it is a slight inaccuracy because it allows an additional option. It allows white to play knight c3 potentially, which people don't usually do because it's very hard to understand. But apparently, if you take the pawn, you're much worse because of bishop to d2. An idea that I have seen before in the Trumpowski, this bishop retreat to protect the knight. In the Trumpowski, there is a line, it's much more well-known than this, where, how does it go? It's something like this, c5, d5, queen b6. Maybe somebody knows what I'm talking about. f3, I want to say. No, not f3, sorry. Oh yeah, here there's the move bishop c1. This is what I thought of. There's the move bishop c1, and it's actually like the main line, I think. So there's a lot of lines in the Trumpowski where white drops the bishop back like this. Sometimes when the knight is on c3. So this is not so uncommon. But it's a hard move to play. And black is in trouble because after queen b6, white gets a huge lead in development and a big center. And if you keep gobbling up pawns, you're just going to get cooked because of the lead in development. So actually, you should start with queen b6, and only after queen c2 should you play cd, cd, and then transpose into the game with knight c6. Do not play queen d4 and blunder maiden 1. What else should I say? If white plays queen b3, then you should play, well, you should play cd. And this is the one small downside of starting with queen b6, because in our version, queen b3 was not a move because of queen takes d4. Here, queen b3 is a move because after cd, white takes the queen, but white is still much worse in the endgame because you have the a file and you have a clear knight jump to b4 on the next move with a great position. e3, knight b4, you actually win a pawn. Okay? So this whole line with c3 is just very, very bad for white. As a very, very quick note, after e3, you do take on d4 first and then play queen b6. Here the main lines are knight c3 and knight a3, but at the lower levels, people often play the very, well, mediocre is putting it generously. I would say it's a mistake, b3. And black is, again, already like slightly better after d5. And I've done some analysis in previous speedrun games. You can hunt it down. But you need to know a lot to play this with black. So if you want to play the c5 lines, you need to know quite a bit of theory. After d5, I recommend d6 and then e5. But if you learn that, then you can basically guarantee getting an exciting position against the London every time, which is very valuable. The downside is that if white starts with knight f3 and you play g6, white can basically move order you into a slightly different version of the London. Here you have to learn a different line. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Like, this is why I put such an emphasis as a more experienced chess coach on learning openings. Like, if you invest that time and you become booked up, like, imagine getting good positions against the London every time. You're like, wow, that sounds great. Okay, and it's not impossible. It's a finite amount of lines. I think it's objectively maybe one of the best lines against the London. Let's finish off with a 5-minute game. What do you think? Well, people can't tell me what they think. I hope you approve of that idea. Let's do a 5-minute game. Ooh, Chak Norris, 19. Okay, so we're obviously higher rated in Blitz. I'll have to play a little bit faster. And we're facing a Smith-Morra. So I have a new line to show people against the Smith-Morra, which I think is excellent from a practical standpoint. It's very rare. And if white is not like ultra booked up, I won a Title Tuesday game with it in the last Title Tuesday, and that helped me win Title Tuesday. So I was playing a strong IM who knew all the theory and still got into trouble. And it's the move d5. d5. This is exceedingly rare. And if white is not accurate, white can end up being like slightly worse. So I'll show you a little bit of theory. Queen d4 is not the move, as you can probably imagine. Now, there's nothing wrong with d takes e4. But the standard reaction oftentimes is knight f6. Although, let's think about this for a second. Knight f6, maybe e5. And, yeah, but then you can play knight c6. So this is fine. Yeah, knight f6. Let's avoid the queen trade if we can. Yeah, knight c6. Hitting the queen. Typically, yeah, bishop b5. And now precision is required, because if you drop the knight into e4, you might get the knight trapped after f3. So the move that I like here is knight back to d7. Yes, we're giving up d5. And no, you should not... Hello? Wake up, Susie. Wake up. I was not playing knight d7 to... It didn't even enter my mind that the queen... I would not move the queen. Whoopsie daisy. He's going to rename it to Alexandra Norris. Yeah, I don't think Chuck Norris would play knight f3 in that position. Although I heard he doesn't even need his queen to win the game. Okay, so the rest is just easy conversion. Let's go b5. We can just grab this pawn in the center and then quickly get our pieces. Whatever, knight c4. Let's centralize the knight. Bring out our... Okay, I shouldn't have allowed knight c6. It doesn't matter. Queen c7. Slight loss of discipline here. You could even take with a king. He's going to go bishop c5. Bishop d4. Sharp castle. Just the key here is not develop your pieces to active squares. Just get your pieces out. Like rook c8. And now identify the biggest target. Trade pieces if you can. And if it doesn't harm your position. And that's kind of the roadmap. So like knight e4, right? Hitting the pawn. Encouraging white to trade. The knight is active on e5. Let's just chase it away. And it helps to have a keen tactical eye. Like here, for instance, if you want to win the game efficiently, you need to have like pretty well-developed pattern recognition. We have a tactic. Who can spot it? How do I see this? Well, the pawn on c3 is white's biggest target. Okay, so that's not the hard part. But in addition, and I've mentioned this before, anytime white pushes the f-pawn and the king is on g1, you have to remember that a lot of tactics occur on or using the a7 g1 diagonal. It's just like a thing in chess that should contribute to your pattern recognition. So putting those two things together, well, there's a bishop on this diagonal, but you can deflect it by playing knight takes c3. So either white plays rook takes. Okay, now we play rook takes, bishop takes, and we fork. Here, the bishop cannot return to d4. That square is no longer protected. Had white taken with the bishop, queen c5 is not as effective, but we had many other moves, such as d4. Okay, now bishop h7 threatened. Never too late to screw it up, but you can do the classic right triangle, rotate the queen, take the juicer, and win the game. Okay, so I think we'll get another one in, last one, just because it's going well, and I don't have too much to say on this topic, on the topic of this game. Very quick opening overview. I don't want to reveal all my secrets, but I'll give you a few things. So d5. When I say it's a rare move, I don't mean there's 5 games in the database, but compared to accepting the Smith-Morra and playing knight f6, d5 is 4th in popularity in the database. 21,000 games DC, 2,000 games d5. What do most people do with white? Well, with white, most people play ed. And now the idea for black is to go knight f6, which leads to a really tricky position where white can very easily be worse. So, well, why do I say that? So the most common move by far is cd. Okay, cd. And cd leads to this position after knight d5, knight c3, knight c6, knight f3, which can arise out of the Caro-Kann Panov attack. So in the Caro-Kann, if white plays the Panov, you could actually get this position. So if white plays cd, knight d5, knight f3, you get this position. Now if black plays bishop g4, you get a very well-known theoretical line. But I really like this move bishop f5. I really like this move bishop f5. And black is a great position here. So much so that if white plays queen b3, which is the theoretical response to bishop g4, after knight b4, black is winning. Simply winning. Because knight c2 is completely unstoppable. Completely unstoppable. And just one funny moment, in this position after knight c2, king d1, if king e2, you had a fork. Black's best move is hilarious, and you have to know it. You have to know black's best move, because if you play knight takes a1, it gets very dangerous after queen b7. The best move is a6. I'm not making it up. The best move is a6. The only cleanly winning move is a6. And it's prophylaxis. It's prophylaxis. The point is now queen b7, there's knight a5, puzzle rush idea, the queen is trapped. You're killing any of white's bishop b5 type moves. And even though white gets a tempo to move the rook away, now the knight drops back with the threat of bishop c2 and bishop b1. And you win. Okay? So you can analyze this position on your... Of course, queen b3 is not the most popular move. Online, I face bishop c4 most times. And now just e6 with a fantastic position. If white plays queen takes d4, this is also not dangerous to say the least. You can play queen takes d5 with a very or knight takes d5, but obviously black is a pleasant endgame. What else can white play? Some people play c4 here, thinking, let's defend the pawn. I'm very smart. c4 is terrible because you can play e5. And if white en passance, you get just a massive lead in development. Actually, the best move is fe. And who can tell me black's idea after knight f3? Like how, in what world does taking with a pawn make sense here? Very important. Very important. e5. Yeah, very good. e5, using tactics to your favor. And you're steamrolling him in the center. And obviously, this is an idea that everybody should know. So this is also bad. White's best move is bishop b5 check, bishop to d7, and bishop back to c4. But imagine how few people, like almost nobody plays this online. And here, white is slightly better if he knows like 15 moves of theory. You play b5, bishop b3. You play dc, knight takes c3. And you can check my Title Tuesday game against Spar, S-Z-P-A-R. And now a5. And you're trying to push the bishop away from b3, so white can very easily be worse here. And then you fianchetto. I like black's position. I think practically speaking, black has a good position here. With very dynamic, and you're playing the Smith-Morra, but on black's terms. So this is where I'll pause the analysis for today. But I'm sure we'll probably get more games in this opening. So queen takes d4. We played knight f6. Probably the best move. Yeah, best move was d takes e4. I should have just taken the pawn probably. Because the endgame, white is simply down a pawn. And if white plays queen e4, the queen gets tossed around. Knight f6 was a little bit more edgy. And it gave white more of an option, more of a choice. So obviously, after knight to d7, instead of blundering the queen, white should have taken the pawn. Here I planned to play e6. And in my mind, I thought we were recovering the pawn. But I completely forgot about the move queen e4. This was a snafu by me. Now, obviously, this is not possible. But after something like queen b6, we're basically playing the Smith-Morra with black. Like we've sacked a pawn and we get good development. And it's not easy to play white here at all. Like you can imagine bishop c6, bc, the bishop comes out to a6. I like this from a practical standpoint. Any questions? Now, of course, our opponent just didn't assume the pin was permanent, I guess. Okay. Last game, guys. An encore just for good measure. Oh, yeah. Just very quickly, if our opponent had taken on... Yeah, let me just fast forward. On c3 with the bishop. Yeah, just a discovery. d4. And a skewer at the same time. So we're just winning everything. Like we can take the rook first or take the bishop first. But this is a very common deflection. And then like queen comes to c5. Let's do one more game. Okay, so we're white. We are playing a strong opponent. Let's go. Oh, I closed the chat. Okay. Have it on my phone. All right, advanced French. Very good. Advanced French. Everybody plays the French now. Everybody plays the French now. It's a disease. Okay, CD is not great, but it's not as bad as some people think. Like, taking on d4 is, well, insofar as it is bad, it's for one reason only. It gives the c3 square for our knight. And one of the main drawbacks of the advanced French with c3 is that the knight doesn't have an easy way to get out of the gate. So here, our top priority is to still keep the d4 pawn protected. So first we should play knight f3, first order of business. And now we can play knight c3. And this is the main benefit. Okay, so now we have several options for subsequent development. If I remember correctly, the best move here, according to the computer, but we'll check afterward. I looked at this line not so long ago, is actually this move a3, which I'm not inspired by the previous analysis. Remember, a6. But there is a very specific idea. The very specific idea is, again, to cover the b4 square. And this is why a3 is usually played. And now you can supplement this move with knight a4. And now the queen is forced back to, okay, well, queen a5 check. And here you'll be able to more clearly see the idea. How should we cover the check? Well, you should be very careful about playing b4 in the French. I think we can maybe get away with this move. But knight takes b4 looks like a nasty thing we have to calculate. Why would we want to calculate that? We can play bishop d2. And now we can put the emphasis on rapid development. So let's go bishop d3. The knight is chilling on a4. It can drop into c5 later. Absolutely no need to move it back. Actually, moving it back would be really bad. It would defeat the whole purpose of what we've done. But now very important position, because black wants to play b5. So how do we ensure that in response to b5, we will be able to secure this outpost? b4. Also making use of the pawn on a3. This is better than rook c1 for tactical reasons. And beautiful. Knight on c5. This is not the bishop you want to give away in the French. You want to give away the other bishop if you're black. Positionally, black is essentially cooked. Black is essentially cooked. Now you could play rook c1 to support the knight on c5. There's also a pawn hanging on a6, but I think we've got bigger fish to fry. Do we want to castle? I want to play accurately here. I don't want to be sloppy. Now, it's not the sexiest move, but I actually like putting a rook on c1, and I'll explain a little bit more after the game. I do like supporting the knight with a rook, so that bishop c5 we can take back with the rook. Not that taking back with the pawn is bad. It's not bad. We get a beautiful passer. But taking back with the rook keeps the queen side open as a base of operations. And black will just get overextended very quickly. Oof. Okay, this doesn't do anything. Let's just castle. Completing the development. Notice that I am not taking on d7. It is not worth giving up this beautiful knight for the light squared bishop. Ugh. Don't play the French, kids. But it's surprisingly hard to, like, take this down, right? It's like, it looks totally winning, but where's the crusher? The key here is to be very patient. I think we're going to play against the knight on c6, a la Nimzovich. There's a famous game, or a la Alekhine. Alekhine Nimzovich, which this position reminds me of. We're going to go rook c2. Okay, knight f5. So the rook c2 had a dual purpose. Now, is there anything wrong with playing bishop takes f5? No, you can play bishop f5. Actually, we might even play this move. But I just want to point out that queen to a1 is a lovely multi-purpose... Let's play queen a1. It's a lovely multi-purpose move because it paves the way for the doubling of the rooks and it protects d4. And this is one of the reasons I played rook c2. And maybe later we can play a4 and chip away at these pawns. So this is positional chess. Now, a lot of you might be looking at g4, but g4 there's knight h4. I think like white is totally winning at this point. There's a lot of winning moves. But let's just play simple, straightforward chess, doubling. Okay, well, black blunders the bishop, but the reason he blunders this is because we're like sitting on him completely. Totally crushing. And now we're just taking all of black's pieces. Yeah. It's funny, the game is labeled as an Alapin. No, I don't accept that. As much as I love the Alapin, no, an opening in a position this bad after like 15 moves can only happen from like a misplayed French. I think my theory is this is where it gets it's a meme, but this is where it gets its like quote unquote bad reputation. It's like if you misplay it, there's very few openings that people can relate to this, I'm sure. Like if you try playing it without knowing much, you can just get wiped off the board in almost every line too, no matter what white plays. It's a very high maintenance opening. Okay, now we want to play bishop takes knight and bishop h6. I'm not commenting on this part of the game. Hopefully my moves are clear enough. Also, I'm looking at e6 and like queen g7. Yeah, resigns, GG. So first, let me show that game that I mentioned, Alekhine. Nimzovich, just keep this position in your mind. I think it's San Sebastian. Wow, Alekhine and Nimzovich played a lot, by the way. San Remo 1930. Wow, I got that completely wrong. Okay, so this is Alekhine's best games of chess. First edition, New York, 1930. 1939, sorry. Nimzovich played the French against him twice. San Remo, he does annotate it. Ooh. So this is the original. Alekhine wrote this in English. So let's quickly, if people want to look at the game really quickly and the annotations. So let me pull up ChessBase. This is a famous model game, and we won't spend long on it, but nevertheless. Okay, Alekhine Nimzovich. So this was actually also a French. This was also a French. Here's what Alekhine says. Okay, here we go. e5, c5, bishop to d2. This rather tame move in connection with the following knight maneuver should not cause black much trouble. Perhaps more promising, only because less explored, seems queen g4, pawn takes pawn. So this is back when, again, this is 1939. So this theory was not very well developed. Bishop d2 is still a move. Knight e7 and knight b5, of course, is the idea. Bishop takes check, queen takes, castles. c3, b6. The wish to solve the queen's bishop problem as rapidly as possible is, by black in the French defense, quite legitimate. But in this particular position, the attempt will prove a failure as black cannot succeed in exchanging that piece against white's king's bishop. Good and natural enough was, instead of this, knight to f5 exclam, preventing knight f6, as played by Lasker, as played by the same Nimzovich against Lasker in 1934. b6, f4, bishop a6, trying to force white's pawn up to a4 in order to play knight to c6, knight a5 afterwards. But the second part of this plan cannot be executed. Knight f3, queen d7, a4. Okay, so he plays it anyway. Knight c6, trying to go to a5 and b3. b4 exclam. Strangely enough, this more or less conventional move created at the time a kind of small sensation. The late Dr. Tarash, for instance, called it in his comments highly original. To my mind, more surprising than the move is the fact that a player of Nimzovich's class, when adopting the plan started by b6, did not take this possibility into serious consideration. Damn, he flamed. Yeah, that's typical Alekhine. He just flamed him. Pawn takes pawn, and he's stopping knight. Comparatively better than c4, whatever. f5 question mark. The decisive strategic error in an already bad situation. In view of the threatening advance of white's a-pawn, the only chance of obtaining some more space lay in a5. Bishop to b5, pawn takes pawn castles is what Alekhine planned, after which the initiative of white would not develop so rapidly. But Nimzovich plays f5, so now you can see why this reminded me of our game. Knight takes b7, a6, bishop b5, and again he's playing against this knight. And look at the rest of the game. Castles, rook c1, rook c2, look familiar? Queen e8, look at Nimzovich's poor knight. Rook a c1, queen e3, and he's going to a4 with his queen. Queen a3. And he builds Alekhine's gun. Sorry, he builds Alekhine's gun. Bishop a4, final move of the game. Or no, not final move of the game. Zugzwang must still resign as a consequence of a complete Zugzwang. An instructive finish, Alekhine says of his own game. h4. After a couple of irrelevant pawn moves, black will be obliged to play queen to e8, after which b5 will follow and win immediately. Oh, Alekhine can just wait it out, and no matter what black does, black is in Zugzwang. Because if you move the king to e8 or you move the queen to e8, the rook on c7 loses a defender, and the knight is lost, and Alekhine wins. Yep, that's how good he was. Well, that's a bad Nimzovich. No, this was not a good game by Nimzovich, but pretty incredible stuff. And this is why I was inspired to play on the queen side. So I think we don't have much to analyze in our game. I will make one comment, which is that in response to, after knight c6, knight f3, the main line is knight g to e7. And here the only thing that you should know is the move knight a3. Here white should play knight a3 and drop the knight away to c2 to reinforce the pawn. This is worth remembering. The way black played it was like a mishmash of different plans. And yeah, so here again, you don't have to rush with b4. Sorry. So we just developed our pieces. Everything was very simple. Yeah, rook c1 I really like. I think this is a good move because I was already thinking about that Alekhine game. And yeah, rook c2, right? Prophylactic thinking. What does black want? Black wants to go knight f5, right? So this, that doesn't mean you should take the knight because the knight is a terrible piece. It also doesn't mean that you have to cover the f5 square, right? You say, why is knight f5 annoying? Because it attacks the pawn. So of course it helps to know the Alekhine game because here the idea of doubling and pressuring the knight becomes much more obvious. Black is totally paralyzed. Completely paralyzed, and of course we want to take with the rook, and we can do the same thing. We can build Alekhine's gun, and if black castles, we can get the bishop around to f6. And that is how we'll end with this simple but instructive game. Thanks, everybody. It's been a long stream. I'm going to get going. I will be taking some time next few days off to prepare for New York, so I might stream once, but we'll try to stream one of the title Tuesdays, and then on Wednesday, on Christmas Day, I'm off to New York, so... thanks for watching, everybody. Happy rest of the week, and I'll see you guys soon. happy holidays to everybody. Thanks again for all the support.